that progress can be made. And we'll see what happens over the coming days. The one thing I'd watch out for is Brett McGurk, the Middle East advisor, the Middle East envoy for President Biden, is he dispatched back to the region. That might be an indication that things are going to move again. But this is a conflict that is now very much spilling way beyond Gaza itself. The likes of Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen have said that their actions are linked to what is going on in Gaza, and if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, then they would stop. I'm not entirely convinced that that will be the case. I think the Houthis in Yemen are getting a lot of notoriety and credibility in the region for taking on the Americans in particular. And I don't think, frankly, they have been dealt a heavy blow yet, not heavy enough at least to stop them launching further attacks. Hezbollah, if there was a deal in Gaza, probably would also mirror it and ceasefire. But that wouldn't be enough for the Israelis. The Israelis want to push Hezbollah way back in southern Lebanon to conform with a UN security resolution that dates back to 2006. And the problem is that Hezbollah also think Israel is violating that resolution. And so I think you might get a difference of opinion, and that's why we think that there could still be a conflict in Lebanon. So there are, as you said, a lot of moving parts. But given that it's been quite some time since the last hostage deal, I think there should be a degree of hope here tonight.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Alistair Bunkle reporting there from Jerusalem. Well, our political correspondent Tamara Cohen is here because UK politicians are also grappling with some of these big questions as well. What's been happening today?
Well, David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, has announced a package of new sanctions against Iran. It's not a direct response to the killing of the US troops over the weekend, but he says it's in response to domestic threats in the UK. The US has taken similar measures, including threats to people who live in the UK, to presenters on the Iran international TV channel. So this is all things that have emerged over the last few months. He spoke today a bit about who those individuals and the group that had been sanctioned, who they are. This is what he said.
Well, today we've issued sanctions against 7 individuals and 1 organisation connected with Iran because, frankly, they were carrying out threats to kill people here in this country. Completely unacceptable, and that's why we've acted. These sanctions are asset freezes and travel bans, and this comes on top of 400 individuals connected with Iran that we've issued sanctions on in the past. It's completely unacceptable behaviour, and we will always respond rapidly and correctly.
Now, he's said those individuals will be sanctioned. Others in his party, and indeed the Labour Party, say the whole of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards should be proscribed altogether, and the UK should not deal with them at all. Can also tell you that David Cameron is due to return to the Middle East as soon as tomorrow. We know he was in Israel and Turkey and Qatar last week. He's going to different countries this week who he thinks could help to try and get the idea of what is being called another pause, what we saw earlier in the conflict with hostages coming out and aid going in, to try and get that on track. We can assume that the Saudis are going to be key to this, as are Egypt and Jordan. He's going there. Andrew Mitchell, his deputy, is in Qatar. They're really hoping to get some momentum going, but it's going to involve, as David Cameron was writing in a newspaper over the weekend, some painful concessions on all sides. He says the UK is clear. Hamas can't be in charge in Gaza, but Palestinians need a pathway towards a state. Israel, he says, needs security, but they may also have to accept a very painful hostage deal.
OK. Tamara, thank you very much indeed. Tamara Cohen there. Well, joining us now is the Public Health Minister, Andrea Leadsom. Great to have you on the programme today. Now, you're here to talk about vaping, but I did just want to reflect on what we've been discussing and the war in the Middle East. Are you concerned that we could be sleepwalking into some kind of conflict with Iran?
I think what's really important is to recognise that you can't conflate what the Houthis are doing with the situation in Gaza. And they want to make it so. They're arguing that they're attacking shipping and risking civilian lives and, of course, important trade routes as a result of what's going on in Gaza. And we absolutely reject that. And it is vital that we find a way to have a humanitarian pause that can lead to the release of hostages and to more aid getting into Gaza.
At the same time, though, what is our end game with the Houthis? Because it feels like they attack us, so we retaliate, then they retaliate, then we retaliate. I mean, where does this lead?
Well, that is an issue that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are working on right now with the United States. And it cannot be allowed to be the case that a terrorist-backed organisation should be able with impunity to attack commercial shipping, risking civilian lives. So we have to respond strongly. And I think that there's a big diplomatic effort going on also behind the scenes, making clear that this cannot be allowed to carry on like this.
OK, now you're here to talk about your policy on banning disposable vapes. Just explain what the thinking is.
So what we're launching today is the biggest public health intervention in a very, very long time. The UK has long been a world leader in reducing the dominance of smoking. And also what we've seen is a massive rise in youth vaping in particular, with something like a threefold rise in 11 to 17-year-olds vaping now, with around 1 in 5 kids having tried vape. So they are being targeted by ruthless companies who are selling them, you know, cherryade flavour and bright packaging that looks like sweets, and it's marketed next to the sweet counter. So youth vaping is one of the things that we're absolutely determined to strike at. It's already illegal, but we're going to enforce much more strongly. But at the same time, the smoke-free generation will mean that for anyone who's turning 15 this year, it will never be legal to sell them cigarettes. And of course, you know, you might say, well, why would we want to do that? Well, 80,000 people die a year of smoking and smoking-related diseases. It takes 10 years off your life. It costs you around £3,000 a year to be a regular smoker, and most people who are addicted are desperate to give up but can't.
Have you ever smoked yourself or vaped?
Yes. So I took up smoking when I was 14, and I managed to give up for my 21st birthday. And honestly, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. It really is. And even now, you know, as I'm talking about smoking all the time, I think, oh, actually, I'd quite like a cigarette. So honestly, it's so addictive.
Bubblegum vape?
No, I don't think bubblegum vapes. No,
Not one
that
for
doesn't
you.
do it for me. No.
Was the government a bit naive when it comes to vaping? Because it feels to me like it's exploded. And yeah, OK, the industry needs to take some responsibility for that. But, you know, you walk down a high street, there's vapes, like you say, in the window, that they feels like the rules and advertisements been bent. Do you think you were a bit naive in not coming down on this more quickly? No, I really don't. I mean, it's been an exponential rise in youth vaping. It is illegal to sell vapes to under 18s. But then everyone vaping as well, right?
Well,
it's everywhere.
It is ruthless targeting by businesses who are determined to get young people addicted to nicotine too early.
Shouldn't you have seen this? I mean, we've seen it with the cigarette industry before.
No, I don't think you can predict that. I think
feels quite predictable, doesn't it?
No, not. I mean, it is illegal to sell vapes to under 18s, and we are taking action because we've seen this exponential rise. You have to consult. You can't simply deny businesses their income. You have to give notice. But of course, really importantly, what we're also trying to do is to enforce. So we're clamping down on illicit vapes. We're clamping down on those businesses, retailers that are selling to underage vapors. But it is still a very important tool for adults to stop smoking. So vaping is much better than smoking if you're addicted to cigarettes. But if you're a child, you should never vape. It's never safe to vape, and it is illegal. So we will be enforcing much more strongly with on-the-spot fines.
I want to talk as well about the attack in Nottingham.
Yes.
An appalling attack that saw 3 people lose their lives. The man who killed them, Valdo Calacane, was given a hospital order. Now, you've ordered a review into the mental health services in Nottingham. How worried are you about what happened and what went wrong?
Well, I mean, it's the most tragic story with the most horrific outcomes for the families of those who are the victims. And of course, you know, we all have our own views about whether that sentence was the right one.
What's your
it
view
is
then?
It is a secure mental institute. I mean, well, I'm not there. I wasn't the lawyer. I feel devastated for the families of the victims, and I can well understand them wanting to argue that the sentence should have been a prison sentence, but at the same time, there does appear to have been very clear circumstances that the perpetrator was mentally ill and therefore should be in a secure mental hospital. So what's really important is what the Secretary of State has done, which is to ask for an inquiry into that, a speedy inquiry from the CQC, which will report in March. Also, the Attorney General is looking independently at the sentencing to see whether that needs to be reviewed. And the Policing Minister is talking to Nottinghamshire Police about what more they could have done. But at the same time, I know that the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary have met with the families of the victims today. And so they're not ruling anything out in terms of where this takes us.
Just finally, we're going to be talking to Richard Walker on the programme later, the Iceland boss who switched to support from the Conservatives when he was trying to be a candidate to the Labour Party. He says that it's your party that's moved away from the centre ground, not him who's changed his position. What would you say to him?
Well, I think that people do change their minds as time goes by. Many a person has come to support the Conservative Party from Labour. He is obviously somebody who's inherited a successful business and wanted to be a Conservative candidate.
Inherited a successful...
Some people might
say...
say...
That was a little... I have to say, that was a stiletto, wasn't it?
So, some people might say that there's a bit of sour grapes because he didn't get a seat. But anyway, nevertheless, you know, he is, of course, entitled to his opinion. I think the Conservative Party is in a great place. We have a long-term plan. Rishi Sunak is the Prime Minister who is going to stamp out underage vaping and protect children's health. He has a long-term plan for the future of this country. Labour doesn't. If Richard Walker wants to go with Labour, do it.
OK. Well, we'll be speaking to him later and getting his perspective on why he decided to switch his support. Thank you very much for being on the programme today. Health Minister Andrea Leadsom. Well, those stories we were discussing sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the political editors of The Sun and The Guardian. That's Harry Cole and Pippa Creer. We'll get some reaction from our panel in just a moment. But first, earlier in the House of Commons, the Foreign Office Minister Andrew Mitchell updated the House on the situation in the Middle East. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, criticised the government and said that Labour had a clear plan.
The ICJ's interim ruling does not give a verdict on the case, but it sets out urgent provisional measures. Labour has been clear. Israel must comply with the orders in this ruling in full. And Hamas terrorists must release all the hostages immediately. But I note that the missing Foreign Secretary made no statement. While the government prevaricates, Labour is clear. International law must be upheld. The independence of international courts must be respected, and all sides must be accountable for their actions. This is why we will press for all these orders to be implemented alongside an immediate humanitarian truce and a sustainable ceasefire.
Well, let's bring in a duo for this evening. The former Deputy Chief of Staff under David Cameron, Baroness Kate Fall, and the former leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Jim Murphy. Good to have you both on the programme today. Kate, you first. David Cameron, of course, you work with very well, really thrown into the deep end, should we say, as Foreign Secretary. How concerned are you about what we can see happening with the war in the Middle East and also, of course, with Iran and the relationships with the UK and the US?
I'm pretty concerned. I mean, look, it's a terrible moment, the 7th of October. It's marked in our minds, followed by lots of devastation in Gaza, and we all want to let more humanitarian aid in. And then we have these sort of Iranian proxies throwing missiles over in the north and the Houthis in the Red Sea. So it really is causing a lot of problems. It feels like it's not, we hope it's not a coordinated thing, but it does feel very, very difficult. David Cameron, I think, is doing a very good job here. And it is difficult for him because he's also got the Middle East and we have, you know, the sort of tensions with China and then the ongoing, of course, the war with Ukraine. So 3 very big issues for him in his intro.
Do you agree with what Andrea Leadsom said, where she was like, no, what's happened to the Houthis is totally separate from the war between Israel and Hamas?
Well, I think it is separate, but it's all in the same area. So it's a very sort of complicated issue in a very sort of hot area of the Middle East. So obviously it's a matter of trying to, work your way through, navigate your way through a complicated issue. I think the Americans are trying to sort of keep it calm. The main thing is there's not more loss of life. And our big concern is Israel trying to protect its security at the same time. We do need to try and get aid into the people of Gaza.
And Jim, you've been working through a company on elections across the world, so it feels like you have quite a global perspective at the minute. It feels like quite a volatile place at the minute.
It is, Sophie. And these things are probably connected. As a minimum, they're adjacent to one another in that what's happening in Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Gaza, Israel, there is a connection and a connectivity amongst them all. But I think our viewers are just unfortunately going to have to get used to this, because not only is it connected, it's long term, because something's happening in the world. We don't like it, we won't enjoy it, but the way in which the world is breaking down into camps and schisms, where on the one hand you'd have the Iranians aligning with the Russians, aligning because they have to with the Chinese, because the Russians are so weakened after the invasion of Ukraine. So, and on the other hand, you've got a series of elections across the world. We've got an election probably in the UK this year, possibly in the same month as a US election, in the same year where Russia nominally has an election. And so there's just a gathering of momentum around a set of factors, which will mean by the end of this year, the world will feel completely different to how it started.
Because you've done some research on this as well, haven't you, showing that, what was it, that if the world was a parliament, the number of dictatorships would be...
So Arden Strategies, our company, tomorrow will publish a first ever research of its type, which we will look at every government all over the world, their politics, their policies, their manifestos, their foreign policy, and then transpose that onto a parliament of 1,000 people. And it shows just what a perilous state democracy is in, because the largest group in that parliament would be dictators and autocrats, outnumbering any other grouping. And in this year, when more people are voting than any year in human history, the pace of change and the way in which the sort of the kaleidoscope can continue to be shaken is very troublesome.
US elections, of course, at the end, and that's one of the biggest worries, the sense there could be a sort of leadership vacuum as they turn inwards to do those elections. So it is a very, very big year.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
the difference is, I guess, as you say, Kate, in the US, much is at stake, and ultimately they are the single global power that can influence much of this. But at least in the UK, when we have our election, if there is a change of government, and I'm not here to make an argument one way or the other about that, unlike in the US, British foreign policy, while there may be some changes, there'll be a relative degree of consistency about engagement. And if anything, Labour would argue that it wants to engage even more, but of course, that's difficult.
Yeah, and different in the US,
Of course.
certainly. Thanks very much, potentially. Thank you very much indeed. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, Iceland boss Richard Walker has switched from supporting the Conservatives to backing Labour ahead of the next election, saying that Labour is the right choice for business. He joins us after the break.
They locked me up for 3.5 years and were prepared to throw away the key. And within a couple of seconds, there were a number of armed security.
An autism patient's dramatic escape from a secure psychiatric care unit sparks a major investigation.
I was petrified.
Follow Patient 11 wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent. From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region.
Hello, welcome back. Well, the boss of Iceland and former Conservative donor Richard Walker has switched from supporting the Conservatives to supporting the Labour Party. He says Labour is the right choice for business. And Richard joins us now to explain a little bit more about your thinking. Great to have you on the programme. So I spoke to you last month, and at that time you said you hadn't decided who you were going to vote for. I wait to be convinced, you said. So what changed?
I mean, obviously, I've taken quite some time and before last month to speak to the different parties and assess their policies and their priorities. And I think it has been quite a journey for me, to be honest. And if I've talked about this previously, but if you look at how I believe the Conservatives have moved away from the values and the principles that I've long held and are shifting further and further to the right, I obviously have thought for quite some time that it's time for a change, and Labour have been steadily moving towards me. And over the last couple of months, I've met Keir, I've met Rachel Reeves and some of the shadow cabinet, and I do believe they're the right party to take our country forward, because they want, in business, we like clear objectives, and it's very clear what they want to be judged on with their five commitments. And I think, they are the right priorities for my business, for the environment, but also particularly for my customers at this time.
So you say you like their priorities. There are any specific policies that you point to and say, that's a great policy for business?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at my business, I've talked about this a lot in the past, but shop worker safety is a really serious issue. This isn't petty theft. This is serious. So I think they're taking a much more proactive approach to things that will genuinely make my staff's lives better and easier. So things like, recently banning zombie knives, because knife crime in store with shoplifting is a serious thing. Bringing back neighbourhood policing, for example, and more police funding. These are all things that I think will make a real, genuine issue. In terms of operational, from a business owner's perspective, they want to get Britain building, and I think that obviously is very important. We need to tear up the planning system and reform it, because if you look at the shops that we're trying to open around the country at the moment, 30 stores a year, all we want to do is invest money, create jobs and pay tax, but every single site is delayed because we have a planning system that is not fit for purpose. And I think Labour recognise that. They also recognise that we need root and branch business rate reform, which is probably the main thing that is causing the decline of the high street.
So last year you wanted to become a Conservative candidate, and I guess there's been a bit of stuff thrown at you from the Conservative side. Andrea Leadsom saying some people might be thinking it's sour grapes. One Conservative source texted me after our last interview and said Richard Walker is no longer running to be a Conservative candidate in the same way I'm not running to be captain of the England cricket team. Have you just switched because the Conservatives didn't want you as a candidate?
I know. I actually had a chuckle at Andrea's comment that I've inherited a successful business, which of course is absolutely true. And that's why it's really important to me to spend time on the shop floor. And actually seeing Keir today speak to my colleagues and customers, he gets it. He really gets it. And he has genuine kind of compassion but he's also pretty ruthless if you look at how he's reformed his party and brought it to the pragmatic centre. But the reason I chuckled is because, of course, we're now on our inherited third Prime Minister, I think. So there you go. But is it sour grapes? Well, I think it's probably for the best. I mean, I was told to pipe down. We talked about this before on things like food banks by very senior people in the party, and also as chairman of Surfers Against Sewage, against the sewage crisis in our rivers and oceans. And it just became patently clear to me that my long-held values and principles are not those of today's Conservative Party.
Keir Starmer hasn't ruled out giving you a job in a potential Labour government. You got ambitions to be an MP, or perhaps any areas you'd like to advise Labour on?
No, I think I've had a swing and a miss at being an MP, and that's probably once is enough. Look, I am very lucky to have an amazing business with 30,000 exceptional colleagues. I mean, Iceland in Warrington today, I'd just like to thank them all. They put on an amazing visit for Keir. And we've got a brilliant platform, and we've got a very serious job to do, which is helping 5 million customers a week through the cost of living crisis. And that's what we're working day and night to do. And actually, it's a platform where I think we can really affect change. We have recently made big inroads in trying to reform the laws around infant formula, which you might have seen. And there's many, many other things. And I think I've probably got more power and influence doing my day job than being an MP.
Fair enough. Great to speak to you, as always. Richard Walker, boss of Iceland. Thank you.
Cheers.
Coming up next on the Politics Hub, a Sky News special investigation uncovers evidence of sexual assault and abuse in mental health care. After the break, we'll be hearing from the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. welcome back. An investigation by Sky News and The Independent has uncovered evidence of nearly 20,000 sexual assaults and complaints of harassment in NHS England mental health trusts. Dozens of patients and their families have come forward to share their experiences, including a mother of two who escaped from psychiatric care. In just a moment, we'll speak to the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, but first, Sky's health correspondent, Ashish Joshi, has the story.
He was touching me, rubbing my hand, my arm, and then went up. He then asked me if he could continue, and I said no. He repeated a couple of times, and I said no. I can't believe I've got into this situation. He shouldn't be touching me. God, he shouldn't even be in my room.
Rivka has struggled with her mental health since her teens. Those were her own words from a diary she kept, detailing a sexual assault on her in a hospital ward by a member of staff.
He said to me he wasn't going to leave until I stopped crying. He told me I am not allowed to tell anyone. He kept saying, I've got a wife and 2 kids. I can't lose this job. And that was really what made me realise how bad this was.
Rivka's attacker was convicted and jailed. In a statement, North London Mental Health Partnership told Sky News, "We are deeply sorry for what happened to Miss Grant while she was under our care in 2016. We have since strengthened all aspects of our safeguarding processes, including ensuring that service users under one-to-one observation are always assigned a member of staff of the same sex."
That was Sky's health correspondent Ashish Joshi with that story. The Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, joins us now. What's your reaction to what we found in this investigation?
It was utterly horrifying. And people, when they're in hospital, often feel vulnerable anyway. You're not in familiar surroundings. You're not always surrounded by people you love. I think what's particularly cruel about that interview we just saw and other cases like it is that when people are under care of mental health services in particular, they are their lowest ebb mentally as well as physically and are particularly vulnerable. So to see abuse on this scale is in itself chilling. The fact, and this is what I think hospital leaders need to account for, the fact that in the overwhelming majority of cases they weren't reported to the police. These are incidents of really serious allegations, whether rape, sexual assault or harassment. They should be reported to the police. Why didn't that happen?
Is that a culture in the NHS, do you think? Almost kind of protecting their own? Or?
I don't know, but I think we deserve answers, and we ultimately do need a culture change that says, if you know that something like this has happened, if a patient has raised the alarm, it's not simply your job to deal with it, it's the job to report it to the police. And I don't think there's laws and guidance in place for cases like this. There should be, but you shouldn't need to be told that in cases like this you ought to call the police. There is also the issue of single-sex wards. And the government have promised since 2010 to get rid of single-sex wards. They have spectacularly failed to do so. There's still tens of thousands of patients on mixed-sex wards. And what did we get from the former Health Secretary at the Conservative Party conference? His big set-piece speech announcement was to say we've got a problem with trans people on female-only wards. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've seen anything in your report that says that that's the particular issue here. The issue here is that we've got, in most cases, men, but in any case, we've got mixed-sex wards where safety and vulnerability is an issue.
So you're saying, and you're right to say that patients on mixed-sex wards last year at an all-time high. What is the problem? Is it cost pressure? Does more money need to be put in to make sure that there are enough? We've certainly got an understaffed NHS, but this is also about priorities and solving problems. So instead of trying to find scapegoats all the time, as the former Health Secretary did with his speech, suggesting that trans people are the problem here, rather than, sexual predators and mixed-sex wards. Would you say, look, we're going to have a fund to try and make sure that there will be enough beds so that we can have single-sex
Well, we've
wards?
committed to the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history. We've pushed the government to adopt Labour's workforce plan. They have. But I think this has got to be a priority because it concerns patient safety. And it should not be beyond the realms of possibility to have wards for women, wards for men, and also suitable, safe accommodation for trans people
so
too.
that should be separate. Are you saying that should be, or do you think trans people should be put in wards determined on their sex or their gender?
No, I think the best thing, both to protect the dignity and respect of trans people, and also to maintain the integrity of single-sex spaces, it's to make sure we've got single-sex wards. And I think that would be the right and appropriate way forward. But at the moment, we've got the awful situation where, as you said last year, mixed-sex wards achieve record levels, and that's not what we want to see. We want to see single-sex spaces because they are safer spaces, and people, particularly women, feel much more comfortable and safe in women-only wards. And the evidence bears that out too, and we've got to put patient safety first.
Let's talk about vaping. Another really important health story in the news today, the government banning disposable vapes. Now, you previously said you would come down on the vaping industry, I think, in your words, like a ton of bricks. So would you go further? Would you make vapes prescription only, for example?
Well, firstly, the reassurance we can give the Prime Minister is, having called for him to take action, we will support him, so he doesn't have to do what he's frankly spent too much time doing in recent months, which is negotiating with the ideological headbangers on the right wing of his party. He knows he can get his legislation through because Labour will support it. We will put children's health and the nation's health first, and we won't play politics with this bill. We want to get it through. There are obviously things where you could look to go further, like prescription only. They're looking at that in Australia, and I'd be interested to see how the evidence is borne out, because I see two problems now with making it prescription only. And had I been designing the system from scratch, maybe prescription only would have been the right approach. But I'd have two concerns at this stage. The first is that in order to be a drug, it would have to go through licensing to become a prescription drug, and I don't think we're in that position. And secondly, the one thing I don't want to happen is for us to lose vaping as a stop smoking tool, because I think the evidence, insofar as we have evidence on vaping, is that vaping is better than smoking. What I don't want to see is, firstly, anyone take up vaping who isn't vaping or smoking, and secondly, we've got to stop kids vaping. And we called for action on this in 2021, a few years ago. So why has it taken so long for the government to act, and why is it they've allowed this epidemic of vaping to erupt amongst young people to the extent where kids are demonstrating nicotine withdrawal in classrooms?
I read an interview with you where you said that you were a bit of a binge drinker occasionally. Like if you drink, you like to have a few drinks. Have you ever had a few vapes after a couple of beers?
I've never vaped and I've never smoked.
No?
So this is not one of my vices. And there's a serious point here for me, and I was one of those people who was enthusiastic as vaping as a stop smoking tool. Where I think the vaping industry, and certainly the responsible agents in the vaping industry, went too far was allowing, almost willfully addicting a generation of children to become addicted to nicotine. And that clearly cannot be justified. It's bad for their health, bad for their education, and we're seeing the consequences in terms of their health and their learning. I know it's a huge issue of concern for parents, and I think it's taken too long for the government to act. And maybe Rishi Sunak should reconsider the big donation that his party took from a leading figure in the vaping industry and put that money donate it to smoking cessation services.
Well, the other story we've been talking about an awful lot on the programme is what's happening in the Middle East. And also, a big part of that is how the US responds, potentially, of course, with a change of president by the end of the year. I just want to play you what happened when I spoke to your colleague Emily Thornberry about the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency and her view on what that might look like. In 2019, you called Donald Trump a sexual predator and a racist.
Yeah.
You said he should be treated like a bully and stood up to. Do you still think that?
Yeah.
So you still think that he's a sexual predator and a racist?
I mean, the evidence is there. So, but, I also think, as I've always thought, that you stand up to people and you're clear about your values and you're clear about what you stand for, and you say as a friend, I'm sorry, I don't agree with you, this is wrong, this is what should be done.
Do you agree that he's a bully, a sexual predator and a racist?
I was more worried you were going to dig up things that I'd said about Donald Trump, let alone what Emily Thornberry said about Donald Trump. Look, it will come as no shock to anyone that I would not be voting for Donald Trump, that I think things that he said about women, about other minority groups are appalling. They don't sit with my values. I don't think they sit with Britain's values. The challenge we would have is, and the decision isn't for us. I don't have a vote in the US presidential election. And the President of the United States, one of our closest allies, the United States of America, is a consequential figure, not just for Britain, but also for European defence and security, particularly since we've got a war on our continent. And the United States has been instrumental, as has Britain, in defending Ukraine's freedom. So we would have no choice if we were the government of the United Kingdom and the American people chose to elect Donald Trump, but to seek to engage, to influence, and to work constructively.
I mean, that's
and
the
that
point,
would be,
isn't it?
and that would be the, you know, that's the thing about foreign policy. I mean, you can pick. I mean, forget about the hypothetical of another Trump term. There are plenty of countries and their leaders in the world right now with whom Britain has a really important bilateral relationship,
I mean, it feels to
including in and around Gaza, where we work with countries and with regimes that have been instrumental in persuading and enabling aid to go in and hostages to be released. The whole point of diplomacy is that you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies, and you do have to sometimes hold your nose and put the national interest and the collective common good of the world into diplomacy. That's what diplomacy is all about.
Is this part of the issue, though? I mean, we could see by the end of the year, Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and Donald Trump as President. I mean, that is, a real possibility. Don't get me wrong, it feels to me as if Donald Trump might not have the thickest skin in politics. And if you've said his comments are appalling, Emily Thornberry said that he's a sexual predator, that's going to be a problem, isn't it?
Well, I think we can make an assumption that should Labour win the next general election and the phone rings and Keir asks us to go in, he's not going to be asking us to be Foreign Secretary.
OK, thank you very much.
All right.
Indeed, West Streeting.
Thanks very much.
Well, to Northern Ireland now, and a crunch meeting of the DUP. The leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, is briefing senior party members on proposals to end the Stormont power sharing stalemate. We can talk now to our senior Ireland correspondent, David Blevins. David, is there an end in sight?
Well, it does appear to be the moment of truth at last for the Democratic Unionists, having boycotted power sharing for the last 2 years and engaged in endless negotiation, it seems, for months and months with the UK government. The party leader is now briefing his party executive on a potential deal that would see the restoration of devolved government in Northern Ireland. We know there is opposition within the party. We certainly know there is dissent without it. Just take a look at some of the protests that are taking place outside the gates of the venue where that meeting is being held. The DUP itself, until now, has been fiercely opposed to post-Brexit trading arrangements, the establishment of a trade border in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Of course, they regard that not just as a trading issue, but a threat to the constitutional position of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. Rishi Sunak's Windsor framework, his New Deal with the EU, addressed some of their concerns, but not all. So they continued to hold their ground and remained out of the devolved government, despite huge pressure on public services without a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland, and despite the UK government offering to pour £3.3 billion into Northern Ireland if power-sharing was restored. It's a big challenge for the Democratic Unionist Party leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. He has spent the day addressing his MPs, members of the Lords, members of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and he is now addressing members of his own party executive. There is speculation he may have something to say to us later this evening, but I suppose that depends on how the meeting goes inside.
I'm sure it does. David, thank you very much. David Blevins there reporting for us. Coming up next on the Politics Hub, Rishi Sunak fasts on Mondays. George Osborne did the 5-2 diet. Boris Johnson said he cut out late-night cheese. We're talking politicians and their diets. That's next.
We all live in an uncertain world. From global conflict and crises to moments full of hope and unity. We'll take you to the heart of the story and help you understand the world around us. Join me, Yalda Hakim, on my new show, The World, on Sky News.
I went through a similar experience where I was sentenced to the electric chair. I remember the judge telling me I was going to be taken to the Rockview State Prison where 2,200 volts of electricity would course through my body and end my life. And then they changed it and made it lethal injection. So I wasn't ever sentenced to be stabbed with a needle, but they changed it. And that's what they're doing here. So what's bothering me and troubling me is they tried to execute this man for hours with needles. Imagine laying on a gurney and they're poking you in your groin, in your neck, all over your body, trying to get a vein to murder you. And you succeed in surviving that, only to be an experiment like a guinea pig. So this is horrifying that the state of Oklahoma and the state of Mississippi are going to start doing this because successfully, opponents of the death penalty stopped them from getting the drugs. I'm so grateful that I went to death row because all my childhood friends died of drug overdoses or violence or suicide, and I was spared the AIDS epidemic, and I started to learn self-respect and self-love. And I elevated my entire life because I was on death row. And even though I was there wrongly, it didn't matter. I needed to use that opportunity. I was physically tortured for years for being a rapist murderer they thought was mentally ill. I went through a lot of degradations, but I learned when people are harming you, you can really find it within yourself at that moment to love you. I was suffering from hepatitis C infection after they beat me and broke my teeth in prison, and I contracted this illness that was killing my fellow prisoners. So after listening to them die in horrifying fashion with the nurses taunting them, I asked that my appeals be dismissed and my lawyers be dismissed so that I could be executed. I spent 23 years in solitary confinement. That means every day of my life I was locked up 23 hours a day while I was being openly tortured. They took me off of death row and they put me in a mental cell because they feared I was going to kill them for what they did to me. So I spent the last 8 months of my life in prison in a mental ward being told that no human being could endure what we did to you without you being angry enough to kill one of us. So we're not going to trust you until we open the door.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, according to the Sunday Times, plotters against Rishi Sunak are known as the J Shiki rebels because they hatched their plans over oysters at the exclusive J Shiki fish restaurant in central London. Now, as the late great chef Anthony Bourdain once said, there is nothing more political than food. Also reported at the weekend, Rishi Sunak apparently fasts on Mondays, some pretty impressive self-control there. Now, all this talk about food got us thinking about politicians, their food, and what it tells us. It's making me hungry, this. Now, there have been some reports of some unusual food choices from our politicians over the years. Dominic Raab said to eat the same lunch combination every day from Pret a Manger, so much so that it became known as the Dominic Raab Special. He did say that it wasn't true. He actually varied it up. Meanwhile, Lady Thatcher was said to be eating up to 28 eggs a week as part of a high-protein diet in the run-up to the 1979 general election. And the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey, lost weight eating cauliflower, apparently. Right, let's bring in Kate and Jim. Any unusual food preferences for both of you?
Well, I do remember when George Osborne went on the 5-2 diet. I had no idea he was on this diet, and I was travelling to, I think, one of the G7s with David Cameron, and we all had lunch, and then suddenly George had an apple. So that was a very strange. Myself, my memory was my first day in number 10, where there's a fantastic canteen in the bottom of number 10, and I was told, if there's some food you don't see there that you'd like, please say. And I was like, please, could you have some yoghurt? And then I saw that, you know, Cameroons love yoghurt and granola with a picture of yoghurt on the front of the Sunday Times.
So it got leaked out, and they were talking about your
they didn't do it, but I mean, I was embarrassed to see David come and say, "What's this about the yoghurt?" You know?
That's amazing. I love how these things just find their way into public consciousness.
Well, for me, I suspect there's probably two. I'm vegan, and so when I was Secretary of State for Scotland, I had to go to a black pudding making factory.
Oh no!
And they wanted me to taste their produce. Now, I think if I ate meat, I still wouldn't eat black pudding. I certainly wouldn't eat it if I'm vegan. And the other one was I was at a family wedding, and my dad and I, we both were served this cold soup. Now, I didn't know that posh people, and my dad certainly didn't know that posh people ate cold soup for a pastime called, is it gazpacho? And we sent it back with much complaint.
Give it a nice fancy name, and everyone's like, "Oh, this is delicious. This is a delicacy."
I don't think I'd be at home and want this posh oyster bar that they're plotting against Rishi Sunak.
It does sound like a very upmarket place. I mean, plots are normally sort of Curry House in Kennington, so they're obviously, you know, well-heeled plotters.
Yeah, that was a very new Labour, wasn't it? The Curry House plots, right?
That's exactly
right. Or the
right.
Ed Bour's lasagna plots. Remember those as well, wasn't that? Ed and Yvette, like
but
having plotters over and making nice lasagnas.
Nothing quite talks like a sort of red wall voter, like a posh London oyster bar.
Yeah.
Great place.
I have to say, I was quite. I mean, the self-restraint from the Prime Minister, though, because this is not just the 5-2 diet. This is a proper fast.
The idea of getting through a day, especially a day in number 10 with no food, I mean, I would find that absolutely. He must have absolute iron will, Rishi, to do that.
Great discipline. I wish the whole of the government had it on other things.
And it's Mondays, right? I need an awful lot to get me through a Monday. I'll be honest. You know, I need some serious calories to get me through a Monday, definitely.
Brilliant.
And a bit of sugar as well. Although I have to say, I am not a breakfast person, so I feel like I've just kind of stumbled into semi-fasting anyway.
No, nor am I. And I never ate breakfast when I worked at number 10 because I was doing the school run and trying to get there in time. So I couldn't have done without lunch, so that would have been.
But the idea of concentrating as Prime Minister for a full day without eating a morsel or a calorie, remarkable. I don't know whether it has impact on his performance on a Monday compared to a Wednesday.
Calm or less calm, we'd have to.
He's into Coke, isn't he? Diet Coke. Maybe that's.
It can't be a weight loss thing.
No.
Because there's not a stick on him. There's not an ounce of fat on I was going to say the young man, on the man.
I mean, the other thing I have to say, watching the video as well, it just made me think about the perils of politicians and food. It's never a great look, is it, I have to say.
We were waiting for the famous David Miliband with his banana. That was what we thought you were going to show us.
You must remember that well.
I remember it well. I didn't know eating a banana was a crime, but it turned into a sort of emblematic of a political career, going up in smoke.
Yeah. Bacon sandwiches, bananas, you know.
Yes, exactly.
Politician killers, they are.
Absolutely. Politicians aren't meant to eat in public, are they?
Yes, there you go.
Or journalists, I assume.
Great to have you both on the programme today, and lovely to speak about a real wide range of issues. I'm hungry after all of that, talk about food. That's it from us tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. though. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah J. Mee, and then The World with Yalda Hakim up at 9 p.m. We'll see you tomorrow, 7 p.m. Good evening.
It's 8 o'clock. This is the UK Tonight. Let down by the legal system. Tonight we'll hear from Emma and David Webber, whose son Barnaby was one of 3 people stabbed to death in Nottingham last summer. Barnaby, Grace O'Malley Kumar and Ian Coates' killer was sentenced not to prison but to a hospital order after being convicted of manslaughter. Today, their families met the Prime Minister with the possibility of a public inquiry if they don't get the answers they need.
I feel now, with hindsight, that I was foolish to just trust in our legal system. I hate to say that because I do feel let down.
That interview in full coming up in just a moment. Also on the way, Ofsted is told to make major changes as MPs say they have deep concerns about school inspections after the death of head teacher Ruth Perry. Tonight, we're going to be joined by her sister, Julia Waters. Fresh hope for the family of murdered Muriel Mackay as her daughter travels to Trinidad to face her killer after more than 50 years. And the village hunting for a missing monkey on the loose in the Highlands. All that to come and much more on the UK Tonight. Last week, the killer of Barnaby Webber, Grace O'Malley Kumar and Ian Coates were sentenced to a hospital order after pleading guilty to their manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judge said Valdo Kalakane would very probably be detained in hospital for the rest of his life. Very probably is hard for Barnaby's parents, Emma and David, to accept when their son will definitely not be coming home. Instead of drawing a line under this part of their ordeal, the Webbers are left with more questions than answers. Emma saying they were foolish to trust the British legal system. Well, this evening, they, along with Grace and Ian's families, have been meeting the Prime Minister in Downing Street, and Rishi Sunak told them that all avenues are open, including potentially a public inquiry.
We have concerns about the police and how they investigated. We have concerns about the CPS and how the case was built. We have concerns about what happened in the custody suite and samples not being taken. We have, and the mental health trust. So this is a multi-agency, in a way, inquiry, which I can't see how all of these agencies will be covered without something really comprehensive. And I think it'll be something like an inquiry in my mind, once the review has been launched, and while that is going to be useful into the very acute failings of the mental health trust, because at the end of the day, this person was a paranoid schizophrenic who was let go on the streets and wreaked havoc. But I think if there are so many agencies involved, there is going to have to be something, pretty umbrella-like to cover all of the agencies.
The father of Grace O'Malley Kumar speaking there outside number 10. We'll bring you my interview with the Webbers in just a moment. But first, Sky's Becky Cottrell is in Downing Street this evening and spoke to the families as they came out of number 10. And Becky, Grace's father there, very realistic about the prospects of them getting answers to the big questions that came out of that sentencing. But